across more than 4,000 years of human memory, the story of Gilgamesh would travel from the clay tablets of Sumerian scribes to the libraries of Assyrian emperors, from the buried ruins of Nineveh to the museum halls of modern London, from the fragmented discoveries of 19th century archaeologists to the foundational texts of comparative mythology, influencing the flood narratives of Hebrew scripture, shaping the heroic archetypes that would define Western literature, and establishing the first recorded meditation on mortality that humanity would ever commit to writing. The name Gilgamesh would echo through Babylonian poetry and Akkadian hymns, through Hittite translations and Hurrian adaptations, through scholarly reconstructions and popular retellings, becoming synonymous with the human confrontation with death itself, and the desperate, doomed search for eternal life that has occupied every civilization since the first cities rose from the alluvial plains of Mesopotamia. But in the ancient city of Uruk, in the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers that the Sumerians called the gift of the gods, in the era when the first true urban civilization was taking shape amid irrigation canals and temple complexes and the revolutionary technology of written language, no observer could have predicted that the king who ruled behind those massive walls would become the protagonist of humanity's oldest surviving literary work, a figure whose journey from tyrannical pride through transformative friendship to the acceptance of mortal limitation would speak to readers separated from his world by millennia of human development. This is the story of Gilgamesh of Uruk, from the divine lineage that made him 2/3 god and 1/3 man, through the creation of his wild companion Enkidu in the wilderness beyond civilization, the adventures that bound them together as brothers, the catastrophic loss that shattered the king's certainty, the desperate quest for immortality that led him to the edges of the world, and the encounter with Utnapishtim, survivor of the Great Flood, whose revelation of the god's secret would ultimately teach Gilgamesh what it means to be human in a universe governed by divine powers indifferent to mortal suffering. The city of Uruk in the 3rd millennium before the Common Era represented one of the most remarkable achievements of early human civilization, a settlement whose population may have reached 40,000 inhabitants at its height, making it one of the largest urban centres the world had yet seen. The walls of Uruk, which the epic itself would celebrate as one of Gilgamesh's enduring achievements, stretched for nearly 10 kilometres around the city's perimeter, constructed from millions of mud bricks that had been shaped, dried, and laid by generations of workers whose labour transformed the flat Mesopotamian landscape into a monument of human ambition. These walls were not merely defensive structures, but proclamations of power, visible for miles across the surrounding agricultural lands, announcing to any approaching traveller that they were entering the domain of a king, whose authority extended from the riverbanks to the horizon. Within those walls, the city organised itself around the great temple complex dedicated to Inanna, the goddess of love, fertility, and warfare, whose contradictory domains reflected the Sumerian understanding of divine power as something beyond simple human categories of good and evil. The temple of Inanna, known as the Yana, rose above the surrounding structures as the spiritual and administrative heart of Uruk. A ziggurat whose stepped platform brought the priests and priestesses closer to the heavens, while simultaneously serving as the economic centre, where agricultural surplus was collected, redistributed and recorded on the clay tablets that would eventually preserve the story of the city's legendary king. The relationship between Uruk and Inanna was intimate and complex, for the goddess was understood to have chosen this city as her primary earthly dwelling, blessing it with her presence, while also demanding the elaborate rituals and offerings that sustained divine favour. The religious landscape of ancient Sumer, within which the Epic of Gilgamesh would take shape, was populated by a pantheon of deities whose relationships, conflicts and interventions in human affairs provided the framework for understanding everything from agricultural cycles to military victories to personal misfortune. At the head of this divine hierarchy stood Anu, the sky god and father of the gods, whose realm was the highest heaven and whose direct intervention in earthly matters was rare but decisive. Enlil, the god of wind and storms and the chief executive deity of the Sumerian pantheon, wielded the power to determine the fates of cities and nations, his decisions carrying the weight of cosmic law even when they seemed arbitrary or cruel to human understanding. Ea, known also as Enki, ruled the freshwater depths beneath the earth, the sweet waters that rose through springs and wells to sustain life, and was celebrated for his wisdom, his cunning, and his occasional willingness to assist humanity against the harsher judgments of his divine colleagues. These great gods, along with dozens of lesser deities governing specific cities, natural phenomena and human activities, formed a divine assembly whose deliberations shaped the course of cosmic and earthly events. The Sumerians understood their gods as beings of immense power but not unlimited authority. For even the greatest deities were bound by the fundamental laws of the universe, the me that governed all existence, and by the decisions reached through divine counsel. This theological framework would prove essential to understanding the Epic of Gilgamesh, for the story presents a world in which gods create, destroy, reward, and punish according to their own designs, but in which human beings retain the capacity for meaningful action, for friendship and heroism and grief, within the spaces that divine attention leaves unoccupied. The king who would become the subject of humanity's first great literary work occupied a position at the intersection of human and divine realms that the Sumerians found both awe-inspiring and troubling. Gilgamesh, according to the tradition preserved in multiple textual versions, was the son of the goddess Ninsun, a minor deity associated with wisdom and the interpretation of dreams, and of a mortal man whose identity varies across different versions of the story, sometimes named as the earlier king Lugalbanda, himself a figure of legend and divine association. This mixed parentage produced a being of extraordinary nature, famously described in the epic as 2/3 divine and 1/3 human, a mathematical impossibility that nevertheless captured something essential about the liminal status of heroic kings who stood between the mortal populations they governed and the cosmic powers they served. The physical description of Gilgamesh that emerges from the ancient texts presents a figure of overwhelming presence, a man whose beauty and strength exceeded normal human parameters in ways that reflected his divine heritage. The epic describes him as tall beyond ordinary measurement, his body perfected by the gods who had a hand in his creation, his face beautiful with the radiance that marked divine favour, his strength sufficient to match any challenge that human or superhuman opponents might present. This physical perfection was understood not as mere accident of birth, but as divine intention, for the gods had created Gilgamesh to serve as the shepherd of Uruk, the protector whose power would preserve the city against external threats and internal disorder. Yet the narrative that would eventually achieve its fullest form in the standard Babylonian version, composed perhaps in the 12th century before the Common Era by the scholar priests in Lekyonini, begins not with celebration of the hero's virtues but with lamentation over his excesses. The Gilgamesh who opens the epic is a tyrant, his divine gifts perverted into instruments of oppression that burden his people rather than protecting them. The specific nature of his tyranny varies somewhat across textual versions, but the consistent theme is one of unbounded appetite, a king who takes what he wants without regard for the rights or suffering of his subjects. Some versions emphasize his sexual predation, his exercise of a claimed royal right to bed new brides before their husbands, a practice that violated the fundamental social bonds holding families and communities together. Other passages suggest a more general pattern of exploitation, forced labour, endless demands that left the young men of Uruk exhausted and their families in despair. The people of Uruk, confronted with a king whose power they could not resist through ordinary means, turned to the only recourse available to those suffering under unjust authority in the ancient Mesopotamian worldview. They cried out to the gods, raising their laments to the heavens in hope that divine power might intervene where human power could not. This appeal to divine justice represents a crucial element of Mesopotamian religious thought, the understanding that while the gods had established hierarchies of power among humans, they also maintained certain expectations for how that power should be exercised. A king who failed in his fundamental duty as shepherd of his people, who preyed upon his flock rather than protecting it, violated the cosmic order that the gods themselves had established, and such violation might call forth divine correction. The gods, hearing the cries of Uruk's suffering population, convened to deliberate upon the matter of Gilgamesh. The great god Anu, father of the gods and ultimate authority in the celestial hierarchy, recognized that the situation required intervention, but the nature of that intervention posed theological and practical problems. Gilgamesh was, after all, partially divine himself, created with godly intention, and invested with powers that made direct confrontation complicated. To simply destroy him would negate the divine purpose that had brought him into being, while to ignore the situation would allow the continued suffering of a people who had legitimately appealed to divine justice. The solution that emerged from the Divine Council demonstrated the characteristic Mesopotamian understanding of cosmic balance, the principle that excess in one direction might be corrected through the creation of a counterbalancing force. Anu commanded Aruru, the mother goddess who had participated in the original creation of humanity, to fashion a being who might serve as match and counterweight to Gilgamesh. Aruru, whose creative powers operated through the shaping of clay into living form, went to work with the raw materials of divine craftsmanship. She washed her hands, pinched off a portion of clay, and cast it into the wilderness, creating through this act of divine pottery a figure that would eventually become as central to the epic as Gilgamesh himself. The being that emerged from Aruru's creative work was Enkidu, whose name would become synonymous with the wild, the natural, the state of existence that preceded and stood apart from the urban civilization that Gilgamesh represented. Enkidu, as initially created, existed entirely outside the boundaries of human society, a creature of the wilderness who knew nothing of cities or kings, of temples or tablets, of agriculture or animal husbandry. His body was covered with hair. His hair grew long and wild like a woman's, or like the grain fields that swayed in the wind, and his only companions were the beasts of the steppe, with whom he shared his existence. He ran with the gazelles, eating grass alongside them, drinking at the waterholes where wild animals gathered, knowing no distinction between himself and the natural world that surrounded him. In this state, Enkidu represented something like the Sumerian conception of pre-civilized humanity, the condition that existed before the gods had granted the gifts of culture, technology, and urban organization that distinguished Mesopotamian society from the barbarous wilderness beyond. The encounter between Enkidu and civilized humanity began not through direct contact with Gilgamesh, but through a series of intermediary experiences that would gradually transform the wild man into someone capable of entering the social world that Uruk represented. A trapper, working his trade in the wilderness regions where Enkidu roamed, discovered that something was disrupting his livelihood. His traps were being sprung, his pits were being filled in, and the game animals he depended upon were being protected by some unknown force. When the trapper finally caught sight of Enkidu, drinking at the waterhole alongside the wild beasts, he recognized that he faced something beyond his capacity to handle, a being of such size and apparent power that no ordinary human could confront him successfully. The trapper's appeal to his father, and through his father's advice to the authorities in Uruk itself, initiated the chain of events that would bring Enkidu into contact with civilization. The counsel offered to the troubled trapper was remarkable in its implications, for the solution proposed was not violence, but seduction, not conquest, but transformation. The trapper was advised to seek out a temple prostitute, a woman whose sacred profession connected sexuality to divine worship in ways that modern readers often struggle to understand, and to bring her to the waterhole where Enkidu was known to appear. Through sexual union with this representative of civilized humanity, Enkidu would be transformed, separated from his animal companions and prepared for entry into the human social world. The woman who undertook this transformative mission is named in the epic as Shamat, and her role in the narrative exemplifies the complex Mesopotamian understanding of female sacred sexuality. Shamat was not a victim or a tool to be discarded after use, but a professional whose skills served vital social and religious functions. Her sexual encounter with Enkidu lasted, according to the text, for 6 days and 7 nights, a period of sustained intimacy that worked its intended transformation on the wild man. When Enkidu finally rose from this extended union and attempted to return to his former life among the beasts, he discovered that everything had changed. The gazelles he had run with fled at his approach, recognizing in him something that no longer belonged to their world. His body, though still powerful, had lost the wild endurance that had allowed him to keep pace with the animals of the steppe. Shamat, observing Enkidu's confusion and distress at this transformation, offered him both explanation and guidance. She told him that he had become wise, that he had become like a god, and that his proper place was no longer among the beasts but among human beings in the great city where a king awaited who would match his power and become his companion. The cultural education that followed this revelation covered the fundamental elements of civilized existence, the eating of bread, which Enkidu had never tasted, and the drinking of beer, which Mesopotamian culture considered one of the essential markers of proper human life. Enkidu learned to groom himself, to wear clothing, to carry weapons, and to understand his role as a man rather than a beast. This transformation was not presented in the epic as loss, though it involved the permanent surrender of his wild freedom, but as elevation, the acquisition of the knowledge and capabilities that allowed human beings to transcend the limitations of mere animal existence. The news of Gilgamesh reached Enkidu through Shamat's descriptions and through his growing awareness of the world he was entering. When he learned of the king's oppressive behaviour, particularly the sexual prerogatives that Gilgamesh claimed over the brides of Uruk, Enkidu's face went pale with anger. Here was a purpose for his transformed existence, a reason for the divine creation that had brought him into being, and the cultural education that had prepared him for human society. He would go to Uruk and challenge this tyrant, testing his strength against the king who abused his power and defending the social bonds that even a newly civilized wild man could recognize as sacred. The journey to Uruk brought Enkidu into contact with the physical reality of urban civilization for the first time, and the text lingers over his reactions to sights that would have been utterly foreign to someone raised in the wilderness. The massive walls that surrounded the city, the bustling markets where goods from distant regions changed hands, the temples whose platforms rose toward the heavens, the ordered streets and established hierarchies of a functioning urban society, all of these presented themselves to Enkidu's wonder and confusion. But his purpose remained fixed, and when he learned that Gilgamesh was that very night proceeding to exercise his claimed right over a new bride, Enkidu placed himself in the doorway of the marriage house, blocking the king's path and offering his body as obstacle to royal transgression. The confrontation between Gilgamesh and Enkidu represents one of the epic's most physically vivid passages, a combat between equals that shook the walls of the buildings around them and demonstrated that the divine council's plan had succeeded in creating a being who could match the king's extraordinary powers. They grappled like wrestlers, like bulls colliding in battle, their struggle destroying doorposts and causing walls to shake with the force of their encounter. The people of Uruk, drawn by the commotion, witnessed something unprecedented in their experience, someone capable of standing against their overwhelming king, someone who could meet Gilgamesh's strength with equal force and refuse to be dominated. The resolution of this combat varied across different textual versions of the epic, with some suggesting that Gilgamesh ultimately prevailed, while others present a more ambiguous conclusion. What remained consistent across all versions was the transformation that the fight produced in the relationship between the combatants. Their struggle ended not in enmity, but in recognition, not in the destruction of one by the other, but in the formation of a bond that both would treasure above all other relationships. Gilgamesh looked upon Enkidu and saw, perhaps for the first time in his life, an equal, someone whose strength and courage matched his own, someone who could stand beside him rather than bowing before him. Enkidu, for his part, recognized in Gilgamesh the kinship that Shamat had promised, the companion whose friendship would give meaning to his transformed existence. The embrace that concluded their struggle initiated a friendship that would become the emotional center of the entire epic, a bond that later Mesopotamian tradition would celebrate as one of history's great examples of male companionship. Gilgamesh brought Enkidu to meet his divine mother Ninsun, who blessed the wild man and formally adopted him as a son, incorporating him into the divine human lineage that defined the royal house of Uruk. From this point forward, the two would be inseparable, brothers in all but biological origin, their identities so intertwined that the achievements of one would be the achievements of both. The immediate consequence of this friendship for the people of Uruk was the transformation they had prayed for when they cried out to the gods. Gilgamesh, who had previously directed his boundless energy toward oppressing his subjects, now had an alternative outlet for his appetites and ambitions. The partnership with Enkidu redirected the king's attention from tyrannical indulgence toward heroic adventure, from the abuse of the weak toward the challenge of the strong. The excess that had made Gilgamesh intolerable to his people remained, for his divine heritage could not be simply erased, but it now flowed into channels that served the city's glory, rather than undermining its social fabric. Yet the friendship between Gilgamesh and Enkidu was not destined to produce simple contentment, for both men shared an appetite for glory that could not be satisfied by the peaceful administration of a prosperous city. The heroic ambition that drove them toward great deeds would also lead them into confrontations with cosmic powers whose displeasure would eventually exact a terrible price. The adventures that would define their partnership and establish their fame across the ancient Near East began with Gilgamesh's proposal of an expedition that would test their combined strength against one of the most fearsome guardians in the Mesopotamian mythological landscape. Gilgamesh conceived the ambition of travelling to the distant cedar forest, a sacred woodland whose location varied across different textual traditions, but which represented in all versions a realm of divine power and supernatural danger. This forest was guarded by a being named Humbaba, a monstrous figure appointed by the god Enlil to protect the cedars from human exploitation. The nature of Humbaba varied somewhat across different versions of the story, but all agreed that he was terrifying, that his voice was the deluge, that his speech was fire, that his breath was death, and that no mortal had ever successfully challenged his guardianship. The cedars themselves possessed value beyond ordinary timber, for the great trees of these sacred groves were prized throughout Mesopotamia for temple construction, palace building, and other monumental projects that required wood of exceptional quality. The motivation that Gilgamesh offered for this expedition reveals much about the heroic ideology that shaped his character and that would have resonated with ancient audiences familiar with the limitations of mortal existence. Gilgamesh acknowledged to Enkidu that he was troubled by his awareness of death, by the knowledge that even kings, even heroes, even beings of partial divine heritage must eventually succumb to the universal fate that claimed all mortal creatures. If death was inevitable, he reasoned, then the only meaningful response was to establish a name that would endure beyond death, to perform deeds so great that future generations would speak of them with wonder. The expedition to the cedar forest, if successful, would provide exactly this kind of immortality through fame, a permanent place in human memory that would outlast the physical body whose mortality haunted the king's reflections. Enkidu's initial response to this proposal was cautionary, for unlike Gilgamesh, he had direct experience of the wilderness realms where Humbaba dwelt. He described to his companion the terror that the guardian inspired, the vastness of the forest that stretched for 10,000 leagues, the roar that could be heard from 60 leagues away, and the certain destruction that awaited anyone foolish enough to challenge Enlil's appointed protector. The fear that Enkidu expressed was not cowardice, but prudent recognition of genuine danger, the survival instinct that his years in the wild had honed to a sharp edge. Gilgamesh dismissed these warnings with the confidence that characterized his approach to all obstacles. He reminded Enkidu that death awaited them regardless of whether they sought it out through heroic adventure or attempted to avoid it through cautious self-preservation. If they were to die anyway, was it not better to die in pursuit of glory, to make their names resound through the ages, than to waste away in comfortable obscurity? Their lives ultimately meaningless, because nothing distinguished them from the countless mortal beings who had lived and died without leaving any mark upon the world. This argument eventually overcame Enkidu's resistance, and the two companions began their preparations for an expedition that would either establish their legendary status or result in their destruction. The preparations for the Cedar Forest expedition involved both practical and religious dimensions that illuminate the Mesopotamian understanding of how great enterprises should be undertaken. On the practical side, Gilgamesh commissioned the smiths of Uruk to forge weapons of exceptional size and quality, axes and swords whose weight would have been unmanageable for ordinary warriors, but which suited the extraordinary strength of the two heroes. The administrative apparatus of the city was engaged in organising supplies and arrangements for the journey, demonstrating that even mythological adventures required the logistical support that urban civilization could provide. The religious preparations centred on the consultation with Ninsun, Gilgamesh's divine mother, whose wisdom and connections to the celestial realm made her an essential participant in any undertaking of such magnitude. Ninsun's response to the proposed expedition mixed maternal concern with practical theology. She questioned why her son's heart was set on such restless wandering, why he could not be content with the kingship and prosperity that were already his. Yet recognizing that Gilgamesh's determination could not be shaken, she undertook the rituals that would secure divine favour for the journey. Rising to the rooftop of her temple in the hour before dawn, she made offerings to Shamash, the sun god who traversed the entire world in his daily journey, and who therefore had knowledge of all regions, including the distant cedar forest. The choice of Shamash as divine patron for the expedition was theologically significant, for the sun god represented not only the celestial body whose light illuminated the world, but also justice, truth and the proper ordering of cosmic affairs. Unlike the unpredictable favour of some deities, Shamash could be appealed to on the basis of righteous purpose, and Ninsen's prayers presented the expedition in terms that emphasised its heroic rather than its potentially hubristic dimensions. She commended her son to the god's protection, asking that Shamash watch over Gilgamesh during the days of his journey and preserve him against the dangers that lay ahead. The inclusion of Enkidu in these prayers, and Ninsen's formal adoption of the wild man as a son, ensured that divine protection would extend to both companions. The elders of Uruk, those senior counsellors whose wisdom and experience gave them authority to advise even kings, added their voices to the chorus of those concerned about the proposed expedition. They blessed Gilgamesh's enterprise while also cautioning him against overconfidence, reminding him that despite his extraordinary powers, he was still partially mortal and therefore vulnerable in ways that pure divinity was not. Their advice emphasized prudence and vigilance, the maintenance of constant awareness that would be necessary when traveling through territories where familiar rules might not apply, and where powers beyond human control held sway. The departure from Uruk marked a transition that the epic treats with appropriate ceremonial gravity, for the two heroes were leaving behind not merely a city, but an entire mode of existence defined by walls, institutions, and the predictable rhythms of urban life. The journey toward the cedar forest would carry them through landscapes that grew progressively more remote from human civilization, territories where the ordering principles that governed Mesopotamian society held increasingly tenuous authority, and where the powers that ruled were older and stranger than the gods who received regular worship in the temples of the great cities. The route they followed cannot be traced with geographical precision, for the epic's concern was mythological rather than cartographic. Yet the narrative suggests a general movement toward mountainous regions lying beyond the flat alluvial plains that constituted the heartland of Sumerian civilization. These mountains, whether identified with the ranges of Lebanon, the Zagros, or some more purely mythological location, represented the boundary between the known world and realms where different rules applied. The journey itself occupied a compressed temporal framework that reveals something essential about the epic's narrative economy and the symbolic significance attached to particular numbers in Mesopotamian culture. The text describes the two companions covering distances in single days that would have required ordinary travellers far longer periods. Their exceptional nature manifested not only in their strength and courage, but also in their ability to traverse space at rates that exceeded normal human limitations. Each day's journey brought them to a new camping place, where they would dig a well, make offerings to Shamash, and seek through dreams the divine guidance that would confirm they were proceeding correctly. The repetitive structure of these travel sections served liturgical as well as narrative purposes, establishing rhythmic patterns that would have facilitated the oral performance of the epic while also emphasizing the ritualized nature of the hero's approach to their dangerous mission. They were not merely travelling but conducting a prolonged religious observance, each night's encampment a renewal of their covenant with the protective deity whose favour they sought. The dreams that came to Gilgamesh during these nighttime intervals constitute one of the most psychologically complex elements of the epic, for they present images of apparent disaster that Enkidu consistently interprets as favourable omens. Mountains collapse upon the heroes, fires rage, thunderstorms descend with terrifying violence, yet in each case Enkidu finds within the frightening imagery the promise of ultimate success. This pattern of threatening dreams receiving positive interpretation has attracted extensive scholarly attention, with some commentators viewing it as evidence of sophisticated understanding of how the unconscious mind processes anxiety, and others seeing it as reflection of Mesopotamian divinatory practices, in which the meaning of omens often depended more on an interpretive skill than on the apparent content of the signs themselves. Whatever its origins, the dream sequence served to maintain narrative tension, while simultaneously reassuring audiences that the hero's enterprise carried divine sanction despite the fearsome challenges they would face. The cedar forest itself, when the companions finally reached its boundaries, exceeded in grandeur and strangeness anything they had encountered during their journey. The trees that grew there possessed dimensions that challenged ordinary comprehension, their trunks rising to heights that seemed to touch the heavens themselves, while their branches created a canopy so dense that perpetual twilight reigned beneath them. The cedar wood itself was precious beyond measure, in a land where substantial timber was scarce, its fragrant and durable qualities making it essential for the construction of temples and palaces that aspired to permanence. Yet the forest was more than a resource to be exploited. It was a sacred space under divine protection, a realm where the boundary between natural and supernatural grew thin, and where forces older than human civilization maintained their primordial authority. The guardian of this sacred space was Humbaba, a figure whose nature the epic describes through accumulations of terrifying attributes rather than precise physical specification. His face was said to be like coiled entrails, a comparison that suggests both the complexity of his features and the visceral horror they inspired in those who beheld them. His roar was like a flood, his breath was death, and his hearing was so acute that he could detect any intrusion into his domain long before the intruders themselves became aware of his approach. The number of his auras or radiances, divine powers that enhanced his already formidable capabilities, varied across different versions of the text, but all traditions agreed that Humbaba possessed supernatural resources that placed him beyond the category of ordinary monsters. He had been appointed to his guardian role by Enlil himself, the chief of the gods, and his authority over the cedar forest carried divine sanction that made any assault upon him potentially impious as well as dangerous. The encounter between the heroes and Humbaba unfolded according to patterns that would become standard in heroic literature across many cultures, yet the Mesopotamian treatment retained distinctive elements that reflected the particular theological and ethical concerns of its originating civilization. The initial confrontation involved an exchange of words as well as weapons, with Humbaba challenging the presumption of mortals who dared intrude upon his realm, and the heroes responding with declarations of their purpose and their determination to succeed. Gilgamesh's courage, which had seemed unshakable during the planning and journey phases of the expedition, wavered momentarily when he actually beheld the terrifying guardian in the fullness of his power. The text describes him experiencing something approaching fear, a recognition that the opponent before him exceeded anything he had previously faced and that his confidence might have been misplaced. At this critical moment, the relationship between Gilgamesh and Enkidu revealed its full significance, for it was Enkidu's encouragement that restored the king's resolve and enabled him to proceed with the combat. The wild man who had initially opposed the expedition now became its essential enabler, his words providing the psychological reinforcement that Gilgamesh required to overcome the paralysis that Humbaba's terrifying presence had induced. The mutual support between the two companions demonstrated that their partnership was not merely the sum of two sets of physical capabilities, but something greater, a combined strength that drew upon emotional and spiritual resources as well as martial prowess. Together they could accomplish what neither could have achieved alone, their friendship providing a foundation for heroic action that transcended individual limitations. The combat itself drew upon divine intervention as well as human courage, for Shamash fulfilled the promises implicit in the prayers and offerings that had preceded the expedition. The sun god sent the winds against Humbaba, 13 powerful blasts that immobilized the guardian and prevented him from deploying the full range of his supernatural capabilities. Bound by these divine forces, Humbaba found himself unable to resist as effectively as his nature should have permitted, his terrifying powers neutralized by intervention from a deity more powerful than the one who had originally appointed him to his guardian role. The cosmological implications of this divine assistance were significant, for they suggested that the hero's enterprise carried approval from sources that could override even the authority of Enlil, or at least that Shamash possessed the power and inclination to intervene in matters that touched upon the domains of other gods. Faced with defeat, Humbaba attempted a different strategy, appealing to Gilgamesh's mercy and offering to become his servant if his life were spared. He promised to provide timber from the forest in whatever quantities the king desired, transforming himself from guardian into supplier, from obstacle into resource. The offer was tempting precisely because it would have provided all the material benefits of the expedition, without the moral complexity of killing a being who had begged for his life and offered submission. Yet Enkidu counselled against accepting the offer, warning that Humbaba could not be trusted and that showing mercy to such a creature would ultimately prove disastrous. The wild man's advice carried special weight because of his own experience with Humbaba during his years in the wilderness, knowledge that gave him insight into the guardian's nature that Gilgamesh lacked. The decision to kill Humbaba despite his pleas for mercy represented a moral turning point in the epic, one whose implications would unfold across the subsequent narrative. The heroes proceeded with the execution, striking down the guardian whose defeat had already been ensured by divine intervention, and the act carried with it consequences that transformed their situation in ways they had not anticipated. The death of Humbaba was not merely the removal of an obstacle, but a cosmic event that attracted the attention of powers far greater than the two companions who had accomplished it. In killing a being appointed by Enlil to guard the cedar forest, they had made themselves objects of that god's displeasure, setting in motion a chain of events that would ultimately impose upon them the very mortality they had sought to transcend through heroic achievement. The aftermath of the battle found the heroes engaged in the practical work of fulfilling their expedition's material purposes, felling the great cedars whose timber had drawn them to this remote location, and preparing the logs for transport back to Uruk. Enkidu, in particular, is described as directing these activities, his knowledge of forests and trees serving practical purposes now that the supernatural guardian had been removed. The tallest cedar of all was reserved for a specific purpose, to be fashioned into a great door for the temple of Enlil, an offering that perhaps was intended to propitiate the god whose servant they had killed. The irony of using timber from the slain guardian's forest to honour the god who had appointed that guardian reflected the complex moral territory the heroes now occupied, their triumph inseparable from transgression, their glory shadowed by the displeasure they had provoked. The return journey to Uruk proceeded more swiftly than the outward expedition, the heroes now travelling with the confidence of accomplished victors rather than the anxious anticipation of those approaching unknown dangers. They brought with them not only the cedar timber, but also the head of Humbaba, a trophy that would serve as proof of their achievement and as the physical anchor for the fame they had sought to establish. The reception they received upon reaching Uruk matched the magnificence of their accomplishment, the people of the city celebrating the return of their king and his companion bearing the spoils of an enterprise that had seemed suicidal when first proposed. Gilgamesh washed and groomed himself, exchanging the rough attire of travel for the regalia befitting his royal station, his restoration to civilized appearance marking the completion of the expedition's liminal phase and the beginning of a new chapter in which the consequences of their deeds would unfold. The attention of the goddess Ishtar, attracted by the spectacle of Gilgamesh's triumphant return, introduced a new dimension of divine interaction into the narrative, one that would prove even more consequential than the assistance Shamash had provided during the Cedar Forest expedition. Ishtar, whose nature encompassed both the planet Venus and the complex of associations surrounding sexuality, fertility, warfare, and political power, beheld Gilgamesh in his moment of glory and desired him for herself. Her proposal of marriage or sacred sexual union carried implications that extended far beyond the personal relationship between goddess and mortal king, touching upon theological questions about the proper relationship between divine and human realms, and upon political questions about the sources of royal authority in Mesopotamian civilization. The sacred marriage between king and goddess constituted one of the most important ritual institutions in Sumerian and Akkadian religious practice, a ceremony in which the human ruler and a priestess representing Ishtar would unite sexually to ensure the fertility and prosperity of the land. Ishtar's proposition to Gilgamesh might therefore be understood as an offer to formalize and elevate the relationship between goddess and king that already structured much of Mesopotamian political theology. The gifts she promised were extraordinary: a chariot of gold and lapis lazuli, storm demons as draft animals, the fragrance of cedars perfuming his palace, kings and princes prostrating themselves before him. Such an alliance would have raised Gilgamesh to a status approaching that of the gods themselves, his authority no longer merely inherited from his divine parentage, but actively renewed and enhanced through ongoing union with one of the most powerful deities in the Mesopotamian pantheon. Gilgamesh's rejection of Ishtar's proposal was delivered in terms so harsh that it constituted not merely a refusal, but a deliberate insult to the goddess and all she represented. He questioned what he could offer her that she did not already possess, implying that her interest in him arose from caprice rather than genuine need. More devastatingly, he catalogued the fates of her previous lovers, mortals and deities alike, who had enjoyed her favour only to suffer terrible consequences when her attention wandered or her mood shifted. Tammuz, the shepherd god whose annual death and resurrection structured the Mesopotamian agricultural calendar, had been consigned by Ishtar to perpetual lamentation. A colourful bird had been struck by her until its wings were broken. A lion, perfect in its strength, had been subjected to endless trap pits. A horse, renowned for its spirit, had been condemned to whip and spur and polluted water. A shepherd who had presented her with daily offerings was transformed into a wolf, hunted by his own dogs. Her father's gardener, who had brought her daily baskets of fruit, was turned into a spider or frog for refusing her advances. The catalogue continued, each example reinforcing the central argument that involvement with Ishtar led inevitably to destruction, that her love was indistinguishable from her wrath in its ultimate effects upon those who experienced it. The theological implications of this speech have generated extensive scholarly discussion, for Gilgamesh was not merely rejecting a personal relationship, but challenging the very nature of divine-human interaction as structured through the cult of Ishtar. His words suggested that the gods, or at least this particular goddess, were fundamentally unreliable, that their favour was transient and their displeasure permanent, that mortals who became entangled with divine powers inevitably suffered for the connection. Such a perspective represented a profound challenge to the religious assumptions that undergirded Mesopotamian civilization, in which the proper maintenance of relationships with the gods through worship, sacrifice and ritual was understood to be essential for individual and collective welfare. Gilgamesh was expressing a form of skepticism about divine benevolence that would become increasingly prominent in later wisdom literature, particularly in compositions reflecting on the problem of innocent suffering and the apparent indifference of the gods to human merit. Ishtar's response to this rejection demonstrated exactly the volatility of temperament that Gilgamesh had attributed to her. Enraged by his insults, she ascended to heaven and demanded from her father Anu the Bull of Heaven, a cosmic weapon of destruction that she would deploy against Uruk in revenge for the humiliation she had suffered. Her threats escalated dramatically when Anu initially hesitated to grant her request, her warning suggesting that she would break down the gates of the underworld and release the dead to outnumber the living if her demand were not satisfied. This threat of cosmic upheaval, the disruption of the boundary between the realms of the living and the dead that maintained the basic order of existence, demonstrated the extent of Ishtar's power and her willingness to deploy it in pursuit of personal vengeance. Anu capitulated, though not without warning his daughter that 7 years of famine would follow the Bull of Heaven's rampage through the mortal world. The Bull of Heaven descended upon Uruk as an instrument of divine wrath, its impact upon the city and its surroundings devastating in ways that confirmed Anu's warnings about the consequences of its deployment. The text describes its snorting and opening chasms in the earth, hundreds of young men falling into these fissures with each exhalation of the monstrous creature. The agricultural land surrounding the city suffered destruction that would impoverish the population for years to come, the productive capacity of the region shattered by the passage of a being whose nature exceeded the scale of any local disaster. The people of Uruk faced annihilation from a force their walls could not exclude, and their ordinary defences could not repel. Their king's personal conflict with the goddess translated into collective catastrophe that fell upon innocent and guilty alike. The confrontation between the heroes and the Bull of Heaven represented the second great combat of the epic, paralleling in some respects the earlier battle with Humbaba, while differing significantly in its circumstances and implications. Where the Cedar Forest expedition had been planned over an extended period and approached through careful preparation, the fight against the Bull of Heaven erupted suddenly from Gilgamesh's rejection of Ishtar, the heroes forced to respond to an immediate threat rather than pursuing a deliberate quest. The combat techniques they employed drew upon the same combination of extraordinary strength, martial skill, and coordinated teamwork that had served them against Humbaba, yet the opponent they faced was different in kind, a creature whose existence was entirely divine rather than merely supernaturally enhanced. Enkidu grasped the bull by its tail, while Gilgamesh struck with his sword, the two companions coordinating their movements with the precision that their partnership made possible. The killing of the Bull of Heaven compounded the heroes' earlier transgression against the cosmic order, for they had now destroyed two beings whose existence carried divine sanction, and whose deaths could not occur without consequence. The trophy they claimed from this second victory was the bull's thigh, which Enkidu threw at Ishtar with contemptuous words about treating her the same way if he could, a gesture of defiance that exceeded even Gilgamesh's earlier insults to the goddess. The celebration that followed in Uruk demonstrated the heroes' apparent triumph, yet could not dispel the gathering shadow of divine retribution that their actions had invited. They had saved the city from the Bull of Heaven's rampage, Yet in doing so, they had deepened the offence against powers who would not allow such challenges to pass unanswered. The meat of the divine bull was distributed among the craftsmen and artisans of the city. Its horns were coated with lapis lazuli and hung in the royal chamber, and the heroes were acclaimed by voices singing their praises through the streets. Yet the very completeness of their victory ensured that the response from the divine realm would be proportionally severe. The Council of the Gods that convened to determine the appropriate punishment for the heroes' actions demonstrated the limited autonomy that even the mightiest mortals possessed when their deeds attracted divine displeasure. The gods debated among themselves, their discussion revealing disagreements about the proper response to events that had killed both Humbaba and the Bull of Heaven, while simultaneously insulting one of the most powerful goddesses in the pantheon. The verdict they reached reflected both the severity of the offences and certain limits on divine vengeance. One of the two companions must die, but not both. Enkidu, who had been created by the gods specifically to address the problem of Gilgamesh's excesses, would be required to return to the clay from which he had been fashioned. The death would not be in combat, where heroic resistance might maintain some dignity, but through illness, a gradual wasting that would allow full consciousness of mortality and provide opportunity for the kind of reflection that sudden death forecloses. The dreams that visited Enkidu in the nights following the Divine Council's verdict carried him into realms where mortal consciousness rarely penetrated, visions of the afterlife that awaited all who passed through the gates of death, regardless of their accomplishments among the living. He saw the House of Dust, that dwelling place of the dead whose residents wore feathers like birds and sat in darkness, consuming clay and dust as their only sustenance. The great kings and priests of former ages reduced to the same condition as the humblest servants who had attended them during their earthly existence. The figures he glimpsed in these prophetic dreams included rulers whose names had once commanded reverence throughout the land between the rivers, their crowns removed and their authority dissolved into the universal equality of the underworld, where no distinctions of rank or achievement survived the passage through death's gates. The queen of the underworld, Ereshkigal, presided over this realm of shadows with absolute dominion, her scribe Belit Sheri keeping records of all who entered, while the gatekeeper Neti enforced the protocols that stripped each arriving soul of the garments and ornaments that had marked their earthly status. Enkidu understood through these visions that the fate approaching him was not a singular punishment, but rather the common destiny of all flesh, the particulars of his death differing from other mortals only in its divine ordination and his foreknowledge of its approach. The illness that descended upon Enkidu manifested gradually, its progression allowing both the afflicted hero and his companion to experience fully the implications of mortality that their previous adventures had somehow obscured from conscious attention. The wild man who had once possessed strength sufficient to wrestle Gilgamesh to a draw now found his limbs growing weak. The vital force that had animated his extraordinary physical capabilities draining away through processes that no heroic effort could resist or reverse. The transformation he had undergone from beast-like existence to civilized companionship now continued toward its inevitable conclusion in the dissolution of the body that had carried his consciousness through both phases of his earthly life. Each day brought further diminishment, the flesh that had been shaped from clay by divine hands, returning toward the condition of its origin through the same irresistible natural processes that governed all material existence. Gilgamesh attended his friend throughout this decline, the king of Uruk reduced to the role of helpless witness, as the companion who had become more essential to him than all his subjects together moved inexorably toward death. The emotional bond between the two heroes, forged through shared adventure and mutual recognition of kindred nature, now became the source of an anguish that Gilgamesh had never before experienced in his career of conquest and accomplishment. He who had built walls that would endure for millennia and killed monsters whose terror had paralyzed entire populations found himself utterly powerless before the simple biological reality of disease and death, his extraordinary capabilities revealed as irrelevant to the one challenge that truly mattered. The conversations that passed between the dying Enkidu and the watching Gilgamesh during these final days explored territories of emotional and philosophical depth that their earlier adventures had not required them to enter. The approach of death stripping away the distractions that ordinarily prevent mortals from confronting their fundamental condition. Enkidu's responses to his approaching death oscillated between acceptance and rebellion. his speeches during the illness reflecting the complex attitudes that mortality generates in beings conscious enough to anticipate their own extinction, yet lacking any power to prevent it. He cursed the hunter who had first discovered him at the watering hole, and the temple prostitute whose civilizing influence had separated him from the animals, blaming these instruments of his transformation for the consequences that had ultimately led to divine punishment and death. The bitterness of these curses reflected the natural human tendency to seek causes and assign responsibility for suffering, to identify points in the chain of events where different choices might have produced different outcomes, and thereby to preserve some illusion of control over destinies that in fact follow their own inexorable logic. Yet Shamash the sun god intervened to remind Enkidu of all the benefits his civilized life had brought: the friendship with Gilgamesh, the fine garments and rich food, the honour and recognition that his heroic deeds had earned, and upon reflection Enkidu converted his curses into blessings, accepting that the package of civilized existence could not be selectively edited to retain only its advantages while avoiding its costs. The death scene itself, when it finally arrived after 12 days of illness, presented Enkidu's end with a directness that spared neither the dying man nor his surviving friend any of the emotional weight that such moments carry. Enkidu spoke his final words to Gilgamesh, expressing both his love for the companion who had become the centre of his transformed existence, and his fear of the darkness that awaited him in the underworld that his dreams had revealed. The contrast between the heroic death in battle that warriors desired and the inglorious wasting away through illness that the gods had imposed as punishment was not lost on either party, the manner of dying carrying its own meaning independent of the mere fact of mortality. Gilgamesh held his friend as the life departed from the body that had shared so many adventures with him, the two-thirds divine king experiencing for the first time the full reality of loss that his previous existence of conquest and pleasure had somehow managed to avoid or defer. The grief that overwhelmed Gilgamesh following Enkidu's death exceeded all normal bounds of mourning, transforming the confident king into a figure consumed by sorrow, and increasingly obsessed with questions that had previously seemed irrelevant to his concerns. He refused to allow Enkidu's body to be buried, keeping the corpse in his presence until physical decay made continued denial impossible, the maggot that fell from the dead man's nose finally forcing acknowledgement of what had occurred. The elaborate funeral rites that Gilgamesh eventually performed for his friend demonstrated the resources that kingship could command, while simultaneously revealing the inadequacy of all such gestures to address the fundamental problem that death represented. He commissioned a statue of Enkidu fashioned from precious materials, lapis lazuli and gold and carnelian, as though the permanence of these substances might somehow compensate for the transience of the flesh they memorialized. The offerings he provided for his friend's journey to the underworld reflected both the requirements of proper burial practice and his desperate hope that some portion of their relationship might survive the separation that death had imposed. Yet the funeral, however elaborate, could not restore what had been lost or answer the questions that Enkidu's death had forced into Gilgamesh's consciousness. The king who had ruled with such assurance now found himself confronting the recognition that all his power, all his accomplishments, all the walls and temples and victories that had established his fame among men would ultimately prove as transient as Enkidu's life had been. The same fate that had claimed his friend awaited him, regardless of his divine ancestry or his extraordinary achievements, and this recognition generated a crisis that could not be resolved through any of the responses that had previously served him. His two-thirds divine nature, which had provided him with capabilities exceeding those of ordinary mortals, offered no exemption from the mortality that his one-third human heritage imposed, the fraction of his being that came from mortal stock sufficient to ensure that death would eventually claim him as it had claimed all other men. The wandering that Gilgamesh undertook following Enkidu's funeral represented a fundamental departure from his previous mode of existence, the king abandoning his throne and his city to seek answers that could not be found within the familiar confines of civilized life. He clothed himself in lion skins rather than royal garments, his appearance reflecting the internal transformation that grief had worked upon him, the polished king reduced to a wild figure whose aspect frightened those who encountered him. The question that drove his wandering was simple in its formulation, yet seemingly impossible in its answer. How might he, Gilgamesh, escape the fate that had befallen Enkidu, and that awaited all mortal beings without exception? The quest for immortality that emerged from this question would take him beyond the boundaries of the known world into regions where no human had previously travelled, the extremity of his goal matching the extremity of his grief and his terror. The first stage of this journey took Gilgamesh to the mountain of Mashu, the twin-peaked height from which the sun rose each morning and behind which it set each evening, the boundary between the world of the living and the cosmic regions that ordinary humans could not enter. The scorpion beings who guarded the gate through this mountain had never before encountered a human at their threshold, their supernatural perception revealing immediately that the traveller who approached them was not entirely mortal, yet not sufficiently divine to pass freely through regions forbidden to flesh. These guardians, combining human and scorpion elements in their terrifying forms, recognized the divine component of Gilgamesh's nature, while questioning whether his mortal portion could survive the passage through the darkness within the mountain, the tunnel of absolute blackness through which the sun travelled during the hours of night. The conversation between Gilgamesh and the scorpion beings revealed the depth of his desperation, for he declared his willingness to endure any hardship, face any terror, traverse any darkness if doing so might bring him closer to the secret of eternal life that he sought. The darkness through which Gilgamesh travelled after the scorpion beings allowed him to pass defied all normal human experience, a blackness so complete that 12 leagues of walking produced not a single glimpse of light in any direction. The physical and psychological challenges of this passage tested even Gilgamesh's extraordinary capabilities. The combination of absolute sensory deprivation and the exhaustion of continuous walking through unmeasurable time creating conditions that would have destroyed any merely human traveller. Yet his determination to find Utnapishtim, the one mortal who had achieved the immortality he sought, drove him forward through darkness that seemed to have no end, his feet continuing their motion through a void that offered no reference points by which progress could be measured. The theological implications of this passage were not lost upon the Mesopotamian audiences who heard the tale, for Gilgamesh was traversing the path that the sun travelled each night, following the route that divine Shamash took through the underworld, from his setting in the west to his rising in the east, a journey that no living human had ever accomplished. The emergence from the tunnel brought Gilgamesh into a garden of the gods, whose beauty exceeded anything the mortal world contained, a paradise where trees bore jewels instead of fruit, and where the very stones radiated precious qualities that earthly materials could not match. The carnelian and lapis lazuli that grew from these divine trees created a landscape of crystalline brilliance that bore no resemblance to the agricultural gardens that humans cultivated within their cities, the aesthetic principles governing this space reflecting divine rather than human conceptions of beauty and value. This garden existed outside the normal geography of the world, in a liminal zone between mortal and divine realms where the usual rules of physical existence were suspended or transformed according to principles that human understanding could not fully grasp. Within this garden Gilgamesh encountered Siduri, the divine tavern keeper who presided over an establishment that served travellers in this boundary region between worlds. Her initial reaction to Gilgamesh's approach reflected the wild and frightening appearance that his grief-driven wandering had produced, for she barred her door against him until he identified himself and explained his presence in a place where no mortal had legitimate business. The conversation that ensued between the king and the alewife addressed directly the philosophical questions that his quest had raised, for Siduri counselled him to abandon his search for immortality and return to the simple pleasures of mortal existence that constituted the only real happiness available to human beings. She advised him to fill his belly with good food, to wear clean garments and bathe in fresh water, to take joy in the child who held his hand, and to delight in the wife who embraced him, for these mundane satisfactions were the lot that the gods had assigned to humanity when they reserved eternal life for themselves alone. The theology embedded in Siduri's counsel reflected established Mesopotamian understanding of the relationship between divine and mortal realms, the fundamental distinction between gods who lived forever and humans whose destiny was death. The immortality that Gilgamesh sought was not simply unavailable, but categorically inappropriate, a crossing of boundaries that the cosmic order had established for good reason and that no amount of heroic effort could legitimately overcome. Yet Gilgamesh could not accept this wisdom, however sound its theological foundation, for the terror that Enkidu's death had awakened in him would not allow him to resign himself to a fate that his entire being rebelled against. he pressed Siduri for information about how he might continue his journey to find Utnapishtim, the flood survivor whose achievement of immortality proved that the boundary between mortal and divine destinies could, under exceptional circumstances, be crossed. The information Siduri provided about the waters of death that separated her garden from Utnapishtim's dwelling place suggested the extreme difficulties that remained before Gilgamesh could reach his destination, for these waters were fatal to any mortal who touched them and could only be crossed with appropriate supernatural assistance. She directed him to seek Ushanabi, the boatman who served Utnapishtim, and who alone possessed the knowledge and equipment necessary to convey a passenger across the deadly expanse. The stone things that accompanied Ushanabi provided the means by which the waters of death could be navigated without fatal contact, though the exact nature of these objects remained somewhat mysterious, their function essential to survival, but their precise characteristics described only obliquely in the ancient texts. Gilgamesh's encounter with Ushanabi began inauspiciously, for in his impetuous approach he destroyed the very stone things that would have facilitated his crossing, forcing the boatman to devise alternative methods for conveying his passenger across the waters of death. The solution they developed required Gilgamesh to cut an enormous number of punting poles, each long enough to reach the bottom of the deadly waters while keeping his hands safely above the surface, each pole to be used once and discarded lest any drop of the fatal water climb the shaft and contact his flesh. The labour of preparing these poles and the exhausting work of propelling the boat across the vast expanse of the waters of death through their sequential use demonstrated both Gilgamesh's physical capabilities and his willingness to endure any hardship in pursuit of his goal. The arrival at Utnapishtim's dwelling place brought Gilgamesh face to face with the only mortal who had ever achieved what he sought, the lone survivor of the great flood whom the gods had rewarded with eternal life and a dwelling place at the ends of the earth. The appearance of the immortal man contradicted whatever expectations Gilgamesh might have formed, for Utnapishtim seemed unremarkable, an ordinary-looking figure whose physical presence gave no indication of his extraordinary status. The conversation between the seeker and the one who had found what was sought would explore the deepest questions about mortality, immortality, and the proper relationship between human beings and the cosmic order that governed their existence. Utnapishtim's initial response to Gilgamesh's arrival challenged the assumptions underlying the quest itself, questioning why the king of Uruk had allowed his appearance to deteriorate so badly, and why he had undertaken a journey that could not produce the outcome he desired. The immortal man observed that death was necessary to the structure of existence, that the gods had established mortality as the human condition not arbitrarily, but for reasons embedded in the fabric of reality itself. The house that was built required periodic renovation, the contract that was sealed contained provisions for its eventual termination, and the hatred that divided brothers could not endure forever, for the river that rose in flood eventually receded, and the dragonfly that emerged from its larval case had only a brief time to see the sun before passing away. These observations reflected a philosophical acceptance of mortality that Gilgamesh's terror-driven quest had rejected, but that Utnapishtim's millennia of existence had confirmed. The wisdom that Utnapishtim offered emerged from a perspective unavailable to any other being that Gilgamesh could have encountered, for the immortal man had experienced both mortal existence and the endless continuation that followed his elevation by the gods, granting him unique insight into the nature of both conditions and the relationship between them. His observations about the necessity of death carried weight precisely because they came from someone who had been exempted from that necessity, someone who understood mortality from the outside in a way that no mortal could achieve while still subject to its constraints. The philosophical framework within which Utnapishtim situated human existence reflected traditions of wisdom that had developed across the millennia of Mesopotamian civilization, traditions that found expression in proverbs, hymns, and instructional texts designed to help people navigate the challenges of life with dignity and understanding. The impermanence that characterized earthly existence appeared not as a defect to be overcome, but as a feature essential to the meaning and value that life possessed. For the urgency that mortality created forced human beings to make choices, to cherish relationships, to accomplish works that would outlive their makers, and to participate fully in the brief span allotted to them. The dragonfly metaphor that Utnapishtim employed captured something essential about the relationship between the brevity of individual existence and the beauty that such brevity made possible, suggesting that the intensity of life derived precisely from its limited duration, rather than being diminished by that limitation. The challenge that Utnapishtim posed to Gilgamesh went beyond philosophical observation to practical demonstration, for the immortal man proposed a test that would reveal whether the king of Uruk possessed capacities that might justify the transformation he sought. If Gilgamesh aspired to eternal life, he must first demonstrate mastery over the lesser death that claimed all human beings nightly, the sleep that suspended consciousness and removed the sleeper from participation in waking existence. The test required Gilgamesh to remain awake for 6 days and 7 nights, proving through this sustained vigilance that he possessed the endurance necessary to warrant the exceptional gift he requested from powers greater than himself. The logic underlying this challenge reflected ancient associations between sleep and death that pervaded Mesopotamian thought, associations that recognized sleep as a temporary cessation of conscious existence that prefigured the permanent cessation that death represented. The man who could not conquer the nightly death of sleep could hardly expect to conquer the final death that ended all earthly existence, and Utnapishtim's challenge offered Gilgamesh the opportunity to demonstrate capacities that might distinguish him from ordinary mortals. The practical structure of the test required only that Gilgamesh remain seated and alert, resisting the natural rhythms of the body that demanded periodic rest, and refusing to surrender consciousness to the forces that nightly claimed it. The outcome of this challenge exposed the fundamental limitations that even the greatest of mortals could not transcend through will alone, for Gilgamesh failed almost immediately, overcome by sleep before he could prove his fitness for immortality. The exhaustion accumulated across his impossible journey, the physical depletion created by crossing deserts and mountains and the waters of death, and the emotional drain of grief and terror that had driven him forward combined to make sustained wakefulness impossible regardless of his determination. Sleep claimed him as it claimed all mortals, his body asserting needs that his mind could not override, his consciousness surrendering to forces beyond his control despite everything that depended on his remaining alert. The failure was not moral but categorical, revealing not any deficiency of character, but rather the fundamental nature of human existence that no effort could alter. Utnapishtim's wife observed her husband's guest sleeping and undertook an action that would make the failure undeniable, baking a loaf of bread each day that Gilgamesh remained unconscious, and placing these loaves in sequence beside the sleeping king. The preservation and deterioration of these loaves as they aged through the days of Gilgamesh's sleep created physical evidence that he could not dispute when he finally awakened, proving beyond any possible denial that he had slept not briefly, but for the full span of the challenge he had been given. The awakening of Gilgamesh and his confrontation with the evidence of his failure constituted a moment of devastating recognition, for the king of Uruk had believed upon opening his eyes that sleep had barely touched him, that he had dozed only momentarily before waking to continue his vigil. The row of loaves beside him told a different story, their progressive states of decay marking the passage of days during which he had remained completely unconscious, their undeniable physical presence refuting any claim he might have made about the brevity of his sleep. The freshest loaf was newly baked, the next showed early staleness, the middle loaves had grown increasingly hard, and the oldest had become covered with mould and completely inedible, their condition mapping the 6 days during which Gilgamesh had surrendered to the very force he had sought to overcome. The recognition that he had failed so completely, that his body had betrayed his purpose so thoroughly, produced in Gilgamesh a response of despair that the text presents through questions directed at Utnapishtim about what he should do and where he should go. The quest that had brought him to the ends of the earth and across the waters of death had reached its logical conclusion in failure, and the immortality he had sought remained as far beyond his reach as it had been when he first left Uruk in terror at Enkidu's fate. The response of Utnapishtim to Gilgamesh's failure moved from the administration of the test to an acknowledgement that the king's time at the ends of the earth had concluded, directing Urshanabi to prepare Gilgamesh for his return journey with instructions that emphasized the cleansing of his body and the restoration of his royal appearance. The condition in which Gilgamesh had arrived, with his animal skins and his wasted form and his hair matted with the debris of his journey, represented a departure from the civilization he had abandoned in pursuit of his impossible goal, and his return required that he be restored to an appearance befitting the king of Uruk. The bathing and grooming that Urshanabi performed transformed Gilgamesh's outward appearance while doing nothing to address the inner condition that his quest had created, the terror and despair that drove him forward remaining unresolved despite the failure of his attempt to achieve immortality through Utnapishtim's intercession. The royal garments that replaced his animal skins and the clean body that emerged from the waters signalled the beginning of his return to the world of the living and the responsibilities he had abandoned, though the journey home remained to be completed and the transformation of his understanding had not yet occurred. The intervention of Utnapishtim's wife at the moment of Gilgamesh's departure introduced information that would extend his quest through one additional stage, for she questioned whether her husband would truly send the traveller home empty-handed after he had endured such hardship to reach their dwelling place. Her intercession reflected the characteristic hospitality expected of hosts toward guests who had travelled great distances, and her question prompted Utnapishtim to reveal knowledge that he had previously withheld from his visitor. The existence of a plant that possessed rejuvenating properties, a plant that grew at the bottom of the waters surrounding Utnapishtim's dwelling, offered Gilgamesh an alternative path to something resembling the immortality he sought. This plant did not grant eternal life in the manner that the gods had bestowed upon Utnapishtim, but it possessed the power to restore youth to those who consumed it, allowing the old to become young again, and thereby cheating death through repeated renewal rather than permanent exemption. The name given to this plant in the text, variously translated as expressions meaning that the old man becomes young again, or that man regains his youth, indicated its function as a means of rejuvenation rather than true immortality. But for Gilgamesh's purposes, the distinction may have seemed less significant than the possibility of escaping the immediate fate he feared. The retrieval of this plant from the depths of the waters required Gilgamesh to undertake a physical feat that demonstrated his continued willingness to suffer for the achievement of his goals, for the plant grew at the bottom and could only be obtained through diving that tested the limits of human capability. The method Gilgamesh employed involved tying heavy stones to his feet that would drag him down to the depths where the plant grew, a technique that committed him to the dive without possibility of retreat, and that required him to detach the stones and return to the surface before his breath gave out. The thorns of the plant wounded his hands as he grasped it, drawing blood in a detail that emphasized the difficulty of the achievement and the price that attainment of the prize demanded. The successful retrieval of the plant represented a genuine accomplishment. The physical courage and determination that had carried Gilgamesh across the wilderness and through the waters of death now enabling him to obtain something of value despite his failure at Utnapishtim's challenge. The joy that the text attributes to Gilgamesh upon obtaining the plant reflected his belief that he had found a solution to his problem, that the terror awakened by Enkidu's death could be addressed through periodic rejuvenation that would keep death perpetually at bay. The intentions that Gilgamesh expressed regarding the plant revealed both his continued attachment to the people of Uruk and his understanding that the rejuvenating properties of the plant might be shared rather than hoarded. He announced to Ushanabi that he would carry the plant back to Uruk and give it first to an old man, testing its properties on another before consuming it himself, and that its name would be called The Old Man Has Become Young Again. This intention to share the plant's benefits with his city represented a development in Gilgamesh's thinking, a movement away from the pure self-interest that his terror had created, and toward a recognition that his relationship with his people carried obligations that his personal quest had temporarily obscured. The scientific caution implicit in testing the plant on another before consuming it himself also revealed the persistence of Gilgamesh's rational mind beneath the terror that had driven his flight from Uruk, suggesting that some part of him remained capable of measured judgment despite the emotional extremity of his situation. The journey homeward began with this plan in place, the plant safely in Gilgamesh's possession, and his intention to benefit both himself and his city through its use clearly established. The loss of the plant through circumstances that combined natural opportunity with supernatural intervention created the final twist in Gilgamesh's quest, transforming his moment of triumph into ultimate defeat and forcing him to confront the mortality he had laboured so desperately to escape. The journey home required rest, and during one of the stops along the way, Gilgamesh discovered a pool of cool water that invited him to bathe, the refreshing prospect of clean water appealing after the rigours of his travels. The plant he had obtained at such cost remained unguarded while he entered the water, and during his immersion a serpent emerged from the pool, attracted by the fragrance of the plant and sensing the opportunity that Gilgamesh's inattention provided. The snake consumed the plant and immediately shed its skin, demonstrating in that act the rejuvenating properties that the plant possessed, and that would now belong to serpents rather than to human beings. The renewal capacity that snakes exhibit through shedding their skins thus received an etiological explanation within the epic, the mythological narrative accounting for an observable natural phenomenon through the story of how serpents acquired this ability at human expense. The reaction of Gilgamesh to the loss of the plant expressed itself through tears and through a recognition that his labours had ultimately benefited not himself, but the serpent that had stolen their fruit. The irony of his situation pressed upon him with full force, for he had travelled to the ends of the earth, crossed the waters of death, dove to the bottom of the sea, and wounded his hands, retrieving a prize that now belonged to a creature that had contributed nothing to its attainment. The question he posed about for whom his arms had laboured, and for whom his heart's blood had been shed, captured the futility that his entire quest had ultimately demonstrated. The impossibility of human beings escaping the fundamental conditions of their existence, regardless of the effort they expended or the suffering they endured. The tears that he wept represented not merely grief at the loss of the plant, but recognition of the larger failure that this loss symbolized, the final collapse of any hope that he might escape the mortality that Enkidu's death had made so terrifyingly real. The return to Uruk that concluded the epic brought Gilgamesh full circle to the place from which his quest had begun. But the text presents this return through a frame that emphasizes not his failure, but the achievement that would constitute his true legacy. The walls of Uruk that Gilgamesh had constructed, the massive defensive works whose foundation he had laid, and whose brickwork he had overseen, emerged as the focus of the epic's concluding movement, directing attention away from the immortality he had failed to achieve and toward the lasting accomplishment that would ensure his memory endured. The invitation to survey these walls that opens and closes the epic created a circular structure that suggested the transformation in perspective that the narrative had accomplished. The same architectural achievement meaning something different at the end than it had at the beginning. Where the opening description of the walls established the setting for the story that would follow, the closing return to these same walls offered them as the answer to the problem that the story had posed, the resolution of the terror that Enkidu's death had awakened in the heart of his friend. The dimensions and construction of the walls received detailed attention in the text, their brickwork praised as exemplary, and their foundation stones noted as having been laid according to the plans of the seven sages, whose wisdom had ordered the world in earliest times. The treasury within the walls contained tablets of lapis lazuli, upon which the story of Gilgamesh's travels had been inscribed, the narrative of his quest preserved in permanent form that would outlast both the protagonist and the society that produced it. The survival of these tablets, their continued accessibility to future generations, represented a form of immortality available to mortals through their works rather than through their bodies, the endurance of achievement and memory substituting for the endless continuation of physical existence that remained beyond human reach. The emphasis on the tablets as objects that recorded and preserved the story connected the narrative to its own material existence as a text, the epic reflecting upon its own function as a medium through which the memory of Gilgamesh would be transmitted across the centuries. The transformation in Gilgamesh's understanding that the epic implies through this return to Uruk and its walls involved a shift from seeking personal immortality through continued physical existence to accepting the immortality available through enduring works and lasting reputation. The walls that he had built would stand long after his body had dissolved. The story of his deeds would be told long after those who knew him personally had passed away, and the civilization that he had led would remember him as its greatest king long after the specific circumstances of his life had faded into legend. This form of immortality, though it preserved the name and reputation rather than the living consciousness, represented what human beings could actually achieve within the constraints that the gods had established for mortal existence. The terror that had driven Gilgamesh from Uruk thus found its resolution not in escape from death, but in acceptance of a different relationship with mortality, one that acknowledged the inevitability of individual cessation, while recognizing the possibilities for endurance that human achievement created. The philosophical content embedded within this resolution reflected traditions of wisdom that extended throughout Mesopotamian civilization, and that found expression in texts ranging from royal inscriptions to instructional literature designed for scribal education. The emphasis on building, on creating lasting works that would outlive their makers, connected to broader cultural values that prize construction and maintenance as fundamental expressions of civilized existence. The king who built temples and city walls, who established institutions and supported the arts, who created order out of chaos and defended his people against their enemies, achieved a form of continuation through these works that biological immortality could not have provided, for his achievements became part of the fabric of the civilization itself, rather than remaining dependent on his continued personal existence. The walls of Uruk that Gilgamesh walked upon his return thus functioned as both literal architecture and metaphor for the kind of immortality available to mortals who accomplished things worthy of remembrance. The philosophical resolution that the epic offered through Gilgamesh's return to Uruk and his contemplation of its walls represented the culmination of a journey that had taken him across the boundaries of the known world and beyond the limits normally accessible to mortal travellers. The transformation in his understanding that this resolution implied had been achieved through experiences that no other human being could have replicated, encounters with divine and semi-divine figures whose wisdom had been accumulated across spans of time that dwarfed the brief decades available to even the longest-lived of mortals. The knowledge that Gilgamesh carried back to Uruk from his travels encompassed not merely the story of his failure to obtain physical immortality, but the deeper understanding that this failure represented the recognition that the gods had established boundaries around human existence that could not be transcended regardless of the strength or determination of the individual who attempted the crossing. The reception of this knowledge by Gilgamesh's subjects and by subsequent generations of Mesopotamian audiences created layers of meaning that extended beyond the narrative itself into the broader cultural frameworks within which the epic circulated and was preserved. The return of Gilgamesh to his city marked the conclusion of a circular journey that had begun with his departure in grief and terror following Enkidu's death. The same walls that he had abandoned in his anguish now welcoming him back as a different man than the one who had left them. The transformation was interior rather than exterior, a change in understanding and acceptance rather than a change in physical condition or social status, for Gilgamesh returned as the same king who had departed, possessing the same superhuman strength and the same royal authority, yet viewing his position and his mortality through an altered lens. The grief that had driven him into the wilderness had not disappeared, but had been transmuted into something more manageable, the raw terror of mortality giving way to an acceptance that permitted continued functioning within the world of human affairs. The journey had served as a process of mourning in the most profound sense, carrying Gilgamesh through the stages of denial and desperate seeking until he arrived at a place where the loss of Enkidu and the prospect of his own eventual death could be integrated into a coherent worldview that did not paralyze him with fear. The epic's treatment of this mourning process reflected Mesopotamian understanding of grief as a transformative experience that required time, movement, and the working through of emotions that could not be suppressed or ignored. The physical journey that Gilgamesh undertook served as an externalization of the internal process, his crossing of mountains and waters and the spaces between them, representing the psychological distances that grief required him to traverse. The encounters with various figures along the way provided opportunities for the expression of his loss and the gradual accumulation of wisdom that would enable him to return to ordinary existence, each conversation contributing to the process through which raw grief was refined into something that could be carried without being crushed beneath its weight. The Mesopotamian audiences who received this narrative would have recognized in Gilgamesh's journey patterns that characterized their own experiences of mourning, the need to move through grief rather than around it, the impossibility of returning unchanged from profound loss, the eventual arrival at acceptance that did not erase the pain, but placed it within a framework that permitted continued living. The figure of Utnapishtim, whose encounter with Gilgamesh had provided the philosophical centre of the quest, represented a form of existence that stood outside the normal categories of human experience, a mortal who had been granted immortality under circumstances so specific that they could never be replicated. The flood narrative that Utnapishtim had recounted to Gilgamesh served multiple functions within the epic structure, connecting the story of the individual hero to the cosmic history of humanity's relationship with the gods, while simultaneously demonstrating the uniqueness of the circumstances that had resulted in Utnapishtim's exceptional status. The gods who had decided to destroy humanity through flood had not anticipated the survival of even a remnant, and the immortality granted to Utnapishtim and his wife represented a response to circumstances that could never occur, the single exception that proved the absoluteness of the rule that mortality defined human existence. The lesson embedded within this narrative framework emphasized not merely that Gilgamesh could not obtain immortality, but that the very concept of mortal beings achieving divine status represented a category error, a confusion of distinct orders of being whose separation the gods maintained with absolute consistency, apart from the single anomaly represented by the flood survivors. The flood tradition that Utnapishtim's narrative preserved connected the Epic of Gilgamesh to broader patterns of Mesopotamian cosmological thinking that understood human history as punctuated by catastrophic interventions through which the gods periodically reset the conditions of existence on Earth. The flood represented the most comprehensive of these interventions, a near-total destruction from which only the chosen survivors had been preserved through divine warning and the construction of the vessel that carried them through the deluge. The parallels between this narrative and flood traditions preserved in other ancient Near Eastern texts, including the version that would later appear in the Hebrew scriptures, reflected the widespread cultural memory of catastrophic flooding events that had shaped the low-lying regions of Mesopotamia throughout human occupation of the area. The persistence of these flood memories across multiple cultures and their incorporation into religious and mythological frameworks testified to the profound impact that such events had made upon populations whose survival depended upon the management of river systems that could turn destructive with little warning. The version of the flood narrative incorporated into the Epic of Gilgamesh emphasized the divine reasoning behind the catastrophe, the council of gods who decided upon destruction, and the single deity whose compassion for humanity led to the warning that enabled Utnapishtim's survival. The tension between the will of the divine council and the independent action of the god who warned Utnapishtim reflected Mesopotamian understanding of the complexity of divine governance, the recognition that the gods themselves were not unified in their intentions toward humanity, and that individual deities might act according to their own inclinations even when these conflicted with decisions made collectively. This conception of divine governance created space for human hope, even within frameworks that acknowledged the overwhelming power of the gods. For if the gods disagreed among themselves, then individual humans might find allies among the divine beings who favoured their survival and flourishing. The relationship between Gilgamesh and his divine mother Ninsun, and the various forms of divine assistance that he received throughout his journey, reflected this understanding of the potential for sympathetic connections between individual mortals and individual deities. The role of dreams and divine communication within the epic provided mechanisms through which the gods made their will known to mortals while simultaneously maintaining the distance and hiddenness that characterized divine existence from the human perspective. Gilgamesh's dreams before his encounter with Enkidu, interpreted by his mother, had prepared him for the arrival of the companion who would transform his life, while the dreams that accompanied the journey to fight Humbaba had provided encouragement and guidance from divine sources that cared about his success. The interpretation of dreams as communications from the divine realm reflected widespread Mesopotamian practice, with professional dream interpreters serving both royal courts and ordinary individuals seeking understanding of the messages that arrived during sleep. The epic's incorporation of dream narratives thus connected its fictional protagonist to real practices that its audiences would have recognized and employed in their own lives, lending the narrative a quality of authenticity that enhanced its cultural authority and emotional impact. The divine responses to human achievements and transgressions within the epic illustrated the complex relationship between human agency and divine control that characterized Mesopotamian religious thought. When Gilgamesh and Enkidu killed Humbaba and the Bull of Heaven, their victories demonstrated human capability, while simultaneously provoking divine responses that would ultimately claim Enkidu's life as punishment for presumption. The gods who created humans expected service and acknowledgement of divine superiority, and heroes who exceeded the boundaries established for mortal achievement could expect correction that reminded them of their place within the cosmic hierarchy. This framework created what modern observers might perceive as a tragic dimension to heroic achievement, for the very qualities that enabled great deeds also contained the seeds of their own punishment, success breeding the overconfidence that led to transgression, and the divine response that restored proper order. Gilgamesh's survival of the punishments that claimed Enkidu marked him as uniquely favoured, his divine parentage providing protection that enabled him to continue when his fully mortal companion had been claimed by the underworld. The underworld, whose existence formed the backdrop against which the entire epic unfolded, represented the destination that awaited all mortals, regardless of their achievements or status during life, a place of dust and darkness, where the spirits of the dead existed in a diminished condition that contrasted sharply with the vitality of earthly existence. Mesopotamian conceptions of the afterlife offered little consolation to those facing death, for the underworld was not a place of reward or punishment, but simply the default destination for all who had lived, a realm of shadows where memory of earthly existence persisted, but without the pleasures and possibilities that had characterized life above ground. The absence of meaningful afterlife hope within this framework explained much of the terror that gripped Gilgamesh following Enkidu's death, for if existence after death represented only a diminished continuation in dusty darkness, then the loss of earthly life meant the loss of everything that made existence meaningful. The quest for physical immortality that this terror inspired represented a rational response to the bleakness of the alternative, an attempt to avoid the underworld altogether by never dying, rather than seeking consolation in hopes of a better existence beyond death. The philosophical implications of this underworld conception extended throughout Mesopotamian culture, shaping attitudes toward life, death, and the proper use of time that remained available to mortals before their inevitable descent into darkness. The emphasis on achievement and reputation that characterized Mesopotamian royal ideology reflected the recognition that earthly accomplishments represented the primary means through which individuals could extend their significance beyond the brief span of their lives. For while the body would dissolve and the spirit would fade into the shadows of the underworld, the monuments and stories and institutional achievements would persist in the world above. The walls of Uruk that Gilgamesh walked upon his return embodied this understanding perfectly, standing as permanent achievements that would outlast their builder, while simultaneously testifying to his greatness for generations who would never know him personally. The immortality of fame and achievement, while it could not preserve consciousness or experience, nevertheless represented a genuine form of continuation that the structure of Mesopotamian thought rendered meaningful and worthy of pursuit. The tablets of lapis lazuli that the epic mentions as containing the record of Gilgamesh's travels connected the narrative to its own material existence as a text that had been inscribed, preserved, and transmitted across the centuries. The self-referential quality of this mention created layers of meaning that sophisticated audiences would have appreciated, for the epic's existence as a preserved text demonstrated the very principle that its narrative advocated: the immortality of works outlasting the immortality of bodies. The scribes who copied and transmitted the epic across generations participated in the preservation of Gilgamesh's memory in ways that paralleled the construction of his walls, their intellectual labour serving the same function of maintaining achievement against the erosions of time that physical construction served in the architectural realm. The survival of the epic into the modern era, its recovery from the ruins of libraries destroyed millennia ago, vindicated the confidence that the text expressed in the durability of inscribed records as vehicles for the transmission of memory and meaning across the vast stretches of time that separate human generations. The library of Ashurbanipal, from whose collections the most complete version of the epic would eventually be recovered, represented the culmination of Mesopotamian traditions of textual preservation that stretched back to the earliest periods of cuneiform writing. The Assyrian king, who commissioned the copying and collection of texts from throughout his empire, understood the power that accumulated knowledge represented, both for the practical governance of a vast imperial structure and for the cultural authority that comprehensive libraries conferred upon their royal patrons. The tablets that his scribes copied and organized would survive the destruction of his empire and the millennia of burial that followed, waiting beneath the ruins of Nineveh until 19th century excavators would bring them once again into the light and begin the slow process of decipherment that would restore the Epic of Gilgamesh to human knowledge. The patience required for this recovery, the decades of scholarly labour that preceded the reading of texts that had been silent for so long, testified to the endurance of human curiosity and the persistence of meaning across gaps of time that would have been unimaginable to the ancient scribes who first inscribed these narratives on wet clay. The significance of the epic's recovery for modern understanding of ancient Mesopotamia extended far beyond the literary and entertainment value of the narrative itself, for the text provided windows into patterns of thought, religious practice, and cultural value that had been lost during the centuries when cuneiform remained undeciphered. The flood narrative that appeared within Utnapishtim's account attracted particular attention from 19th century scholars who recognized its relationship to biblical traditions, the implications of this parallel for understanding the transmission of stories across ancient Near Eastern cultures, reshaping scholarly approaches to texts that had previously been studied in isolation. The recognition that the Hebrew flood story shared ancestry with Mesopotamian versions of the same narrative connected Israelite religion to the broader cultural environment within which it had developed, challenging interpretive frameworks that had emphasized the unique and unconnected nature of biblical revelation. The controversies that this recognition provoked among religious and scholarly communities demonstrated the power of recovered ancient texts to reshape modern understanding. The tablets that emerged from Mesopotamian ruins carrying implications that extended far beyond their original contexts of composition and reception. The cultural reception of the Epic of Gilgamesh following its recovery and translation created new layers of meaning that accumulated around the ancient narrative as modern readers brought their own concerns and questions to a text that had been produced under conditions vastly different from their own. The themes of friendship, mortality, and the search for meaning that the epic explored resonated with modern readers who found in the ancient narrative expressions of concerns that remained relevant across the millennia that separated them from the original Mesopotamian audiences. The figure of Gilgamesh himself became available as a symbol and reference point for modern discussions of heroism, grief, and human limitation, his journey from arrogance through loss to acceptance, providing a template that subsequent literary and philosophical traditions could employ and adapt. The epic's status as the oldest known work of literature conferred upon it a significance that derived from its temporal priority, as well as from its intrinsic qualities, the narrative representing not merely one ancient story among many, but the first extended narrative that human beings had committed to permanent written form. The questions that the epic addressed regarding the nature of human existence, the relationships between mortals and gods, and the possibilities for meaning within finite lives continued to demand attention from readers separated from the original context by thousands of years of subsequent human development. The absence of easy answers within the narrative, the refusal to provide Gilgamesh with the immortality he sought, or to offer comfortable assurances about existence after death, lent the text a philosophical seriousness that distinguished it from narratives that resolved their tensions through divine intervention or miraculous transformation. The acceptance that the epic finally offered was hard-won, and arrived at through suffering, the wisdom of Utnapishtim, and the lesson of the plant that the serpent stole combining to direct Gilgamesh toward the only form of continuation available to mortals within the framework that the gods had established. The walls of Uruk that awaited his return, the tablets that would preserve his story, the reputation that would endure long after his body had dissolved into the earth, these represented what human beings could actually achieve, and the epic's suggestion that these achievements constituted a meaningful response to mortality offered a form of consolation that did not depend upon illusions or false hopes. The religious dimensions of the epic connected the narrative of individual heroic quest to the broader framework of Mesopotamian cosmology, within which human existence found its meaning and purpose. The gods who created humans to serve them, who established the boundaries between mortal and immortal existence, who periodically intervened in human affairs through dreams, omens, and direct action. These divine beings formed the context within which Gilgamesh's journey unfolded and acquired its significance. The temples that Gilgamesh built and maintained in Uruk served as focal points for the relationship between the human community and the divine powers whose favour sustained the city's prosperity, the king's religious responsibilities constituting one dimension of the complex role that Mesopotamian monarchs were expected to fulfill. The return of Gilgamesh to these responsibilities following his failed quest for personal immortality represented a reintegration into the social and religious structures that defined civilized existence, the king resuming the duties that connected him to both his divine ancestors and his human subjects. The transformation that Gilgamesh underwent during his return journey to Uruk manifested itself in ways both subtle and profound. The king, who had departed his city in wild grief, returning as a figure tempered by failure and illuminated by acceptance. The cedar boat that carried him across the waters of death one final time bore a passenger fundamentally altered from the desperate seeker who had arrived at Utnapishtim's distant shore demanding the secret of eternal life. The loss of the plant that would have restored youth had stripped away Gilgamesh's last hope for personal transcendence of mortality, leaving him to confront the implications of his human nature without the consolation of even potential escape from death's universal dominion. The serpent that had stolen his prize while he bathed in the cool pool had acted according to its nature, the creature's theft representing not malice but simply the operation of the world as the gods had constructed it, a world in which human intentions frequently dissolved before the relentless processes of natural existence. The shedding of the serpent's skin as it departed with the plant demonstrated that the power of renewal remained operative within the created order, though that power belonged to creatures other than humans and could not be transferred regardless of heroic effort or divine favour. The philosophical dimensions of Gilgamesh's return encompassed his recognition that the quest itself had constituted its own form of achievement, the journey providing experiences and understanding that no one who remained within Uruk's walls could have obtained. The knowledge he carried back from the edges of the world, the story of the flood that Utnapishtim had survived, the understanding of how the gods had ordered existence, the wisdom regarding what humans could and could not accomplish. This knowledge represented a treasure more substantial than the lost plant, though perhaps less immediately satisfying to one who had hoped to defeat death through physical means. The education that Gilgamesh had received through suffering exceeded what any tutor could have provided. The lessons inscribed upon his spirit through loss and failure and eventual acceptance creating understanding that mere instruction could never achieve. The death of Enkidu had initiated this education, the grief that followed had driven the quest that continued it, and the failure at the pool had completed it, leaving Gilgamesh equipped with wisdom that he could employ for the remainder of his mortal existence. The landscape through which Gilgamesh travelled during his return journey appeared different to him than it had during his desperate outward passage, the same territories perceived through eyes that had been transformed by the experiences of the intervening period. The wilderness regions that had seemed merely obstacles to be overcome now revealed themselves as components of the ordered world that the gods had established, each feature of the terrain representing the divine creative activity that had shaped existence according to purposes that transcended human comprehension. The mountains and valleys, the rivers and forests, the creatures that inhabited each environment, all of these constituted expressions of the sacred order within which Gilgamesh occupied his appointed place, a place that carried its own dignity despite lacking the immortality that belonged to the gods alone. The appreciation of the created world that emerged from this transformed perception offered Gilgamesh a form of consolation that the quest for immortality had sought to supersede, the beauty and complexity of existence, providing meaning even within the constraints of mortality. The approach to Uruk from the perspective of one returning after prolonged absence revealed the city in ways that familiarity had previously obscured, the walls that Gilgamesh had built appearing in their full magnificence to eyes that had witnessed the edges of the world. The fired brick construction that rose from the Mesopotamian plain demonstrated human capacity for achievement that endured beyond individual lifetimes, the walls representing cooperative effort across generations that produced monuments exceeding what any single person could accomplish. The circuit of these walls, measuring the full distance that Gilgamesh had specified during the height of his creative energies, enclosed the sacred space within which civilized existence unfolded according to patterns established by the founders and maintained by their successors. The temples that rose within this protected space honoured the gods whose favour sustained the city, the religious architecture providing focal points for the relationship between divine and human realms that defined Mesopotamian culture. The Eanna temple complex dedicated to Ishtar occupied its central position within the urban fabric, the goddess whose proposal Gilgamesh had rejected, maintaining her claim upon the devotion of the city's inhabitants, regardless of their king's personal choices. The recognition that these achievements would endure after Gilgamesh's individual existence had concluded provided the foundation for the acceptance that the returning king had finally attained. The walls of Uruk would continue to protect the city's inhabitants long after the hands that had directed their construction had dissolved into the earth that received all mortal remains. The temples would continue to receive the devotion of worshippers who would know Gilgamesh only as a name associated with the city's greatness, rather than as a living presence walking among them. The institutions of governance and justice that the king had established would continue to organize social existence according to principles that transcended the tenure of any individual monarch. These continuations constituted the only form of immortality available to human beings within the framework that the gods had established, and the epic's conclusion suggested that this form of continuation could provide genuine meaning despite falling short of the personal deathlessness that Gilgamesh had initially sought. The textual tradition that preserved the Epic of Gilgamesh for subsequent generations demonstrated the very principle of continuation through achievement that the narrative itself advocated. The scribes who copied and transmitted the text ensuring that Gilgamesh's story would survive the collapse of the civilizations within which it had been composed. The clay tablets that bore the cuneiform signs encoding the narrative proved more durable than the human bodies of those who inscribed them, the medium of preservation outlasting its creators just as the walls of Uruk outlasted their builder. The relationship between writing and immortality that the epic implicitly celebrated found its confirmation in the survival of the text itself across millennia, during which countless generations lived, died, and were forgotten. The modern scholars who recovered and translated the tablets participated in a process of cultural transmission that connected contemporary readers to the concerns of audiences separated from them by thousands of years, the narrative continuing to find recipients long after its original context had disappeared. The final section of the standard Babylonian version directed attention explicitly to the walls of Uruk as the proper focus for contemplation of Gilgamesh's achievement, the text inviting readers to consider the magnificence of the construction as evidence of what mortals could accomplish within the limits that the gods had established. The invitation to walk the circuit of the walls, to examine the quality of the brickwork, to appreciate the foundation that had been laid, this direction toward material achievement represented the epic's practical response to the problem of mortality that had driven the narrative from its beginning. The walls did not offer escape from death, but they demonstrated that human effort could produce results that outlasted individual human lives, creating a legacy that subsequent generations would inherit and maintain. The contrast between the failed quest for personal immortality and the successful achievement of enduring construction crystallized the wisdom that Gilgamesh had acquired through his suffering, the king learning to value what could actually be accomplished rather than lamenting what remained forever beyond reach. The integration of this practical wisdom with the religious framework of Mesopotamian culture produced a coherent worldview that accepted human limitation while affirming human dignity within the bounds that the gods had established. The relationship between mortals and immortals that the epic depicted was not one of simple subordination but rather of complementarity, humans serving purposes within the divine economy that the gods themselves valued even as they maintained their superior status. The cities that humans built and maintained provided dwelling places for divine presence, the temples serving as earthly residences for gods who required human devotion and service. The agricultural labour that humans performed produced the surplus that supported both human civilization and divine cult, the offerings that worshippers brought to the temples representing the fruits of toil that the gods had ordained as human destiny. The wisdom literature and mythological narratives that humans composed and preserved served divine purposes of instruction and remembrance, the scribal tradition that transmitted the Epic of Gilgamesh participating in the broader cultural project of maintaining the knowledge that the gods wished to perpetuate. The implications of the epic's conclusion for understanding Mesopotamian attitudes toward death and remembrance extended beyond the individual narrative to illuminate broader cultural patterns that shaped ancient Near Eastern civilization. The royal inscriptions that Mesopotamian kings produced throughout the millennia of cuneiform culture shared with the Epic of Gilgamesh the assumption that commemoration through text and monument provided the appropriate response to mortality, the records of achievement serving to extend royal presence beyond the boundaries of individual existence. The concern with establishing one's name that pervaded Mesopotamian royal ideology found its literary expression in the Gilgamesh narrative, the king's ultimate acceptance of monumental achievement as his proper legacy reflecting values that actual monarchs sought to realize through their building programs and textual productions. The continuity between legendary narrative and historical practice suggested that the epic articulated ideals that Mesopotamian culture broadly endorsed, the story of Gilgamesh serving as exemplary reflection upon concerns that shaped royal behavior across the region's political history. The relationship between the epic's composition and the theological frameworks within which Mesopotamian thinkers, understood divine-human relations revealed the text's participation in broader intellectual traditions that sought to explain the conditions of human existence. The gods who appeared throughout the narrative, Anu, Enlil, Shamash, Ishtar, Ea, belong to a pantheon whose interactions shape the cosmos according to principles that theological speculation sought to comprehend and articulate. The council of the gods that determined human fate operated according to procedures that maintained cosmic order, while responding to circumstances that required divine deliberation and decision. The flood narrative that Utnapishtim recounted depicted divine anger followed by divine regret, the gods learning from their own actions that wholesale destruction served neither divine nor human interests. The development of theological understanding that this narrative implied suggested that the relationship between gods and humans evolved over time, the post-flood arrangement establishing new parameters for interaction that both parties would subsequently observe. The preservation of Gilgamesh's story through the scribal traditions of ancient Mesopotamia required sustained institutional support that only the major cultural centres of the region could provide. The temple complexes and palace administrations that maintained scribal schools ensured the transmission of textual traditions across generations, the education of new scribes including the copying of canonical texts that demonstrated proper cuneiform technique while conveying cultural knowledge. The Epic of Gilgamesh achieved canonical status within this educational system, the text appearing in school contexts throughout the region as a standard component of scribal training. The copies that resulted from this pedagogical function contributed to the textual tradition's preservation, the distribution of tablets across multiple sites providing redundancy that protected against local destruction. The irony that much of our knowledge of the epic derives from tablets discarded as practice exercises or stored in archives that their creators never expected anyone to read, again demonstrated how preservation sometimes occurred through channels that the original producers could not have anticipated. The archaeological context within which tablets bearing the Epic of Gilgamesh were discovered illuminated the social and institutional frameworks within which the text circulated during its period of active use. The library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh, which yielded the most complete version of the standard Babylonian edition, represented the culmination of systematic collection efforts that the Neo-Assyrian king had pursued as part of his broader program of cultural consolidation. The scribes whom Ashurbanipal employed to gather and copy texts from throughout Mesopotamia participated in a project of imperial knowledge accumulation that sought to concentrate textual resources at the Assyrian capital. The destruction of Nineveh in 612 BCE by the combined forces of Babylonians and Medes buried this library beneath the ruins of the collapsed palace, paradoxically preserving the tablets through the same catastrophe that ended the Assyrian Empire. The recovery of these tablets during 19th century excavations brought the Epic of Gilgamesh back into human awareness after more than 2 millennia of oblivion, the text emerging from the earth to find new audiences in a world utterly transformed from the one within which it had originally circulated. The emotional resonance that the epic achieved through its treatment of friendship, loss, and acceptance connected ancient and modern readers across the vast temporal gulf that separated them, the universal dimensions of human experience providing common ground for understanding despite profound differences in cultural context. The grief that Gilgamesh experienced following Enkidu's death spoke to anyone who had known the loss of someone beloved, the intensity of the king's mourning validating emotional responses that transcended cultural boundaries. The fear of death that drove Gilgamesh's quest resonated with audiences who recognized in their own lives the anxiety that mortality provoked, the desperate hope that somehow death might be escaped or defeated, expressing wishes that human beings in all eras have entertained. The acceptance that Gilgamesh finally achieved offered a model for coming to terms with limitation that modern readers could apply to their own confrontations with finitude, the ancient king's journey providing a pattern for the interior work that mortality required of all who recognized its reality. The literary artistry through which the epic conveyed its themes demonstrated the sophistication of ancient Mesopotamian narrative composition, the techniques employed by the text's authors achieving effects that continued to impress readers familiar with the subsequent development of literary tradition. The structural parallels between the epic's beginning and conclusion created circularity that reinforced the thematic content, Gilgamesh is returned to where he started, representing both geographic and psychological completion. The transformation in the king's character between these parallel passages measured the distance that the narrative had travelled, the same walls appearing in utterly different significance to the consciousness that contemplated them. The repetition of formulaic phrases throughout the text created rhythmic patterns that ancient audiences would have experienced through oral performance, the recurrence of familiar expressions providing structural coherence while allowing variation in the specific content that each occurrence framed. The balance between divine and human perspectives that the narrative maintained allowed audiences to comprehend events from multiple angles, the gods' council scenes providing cosmic context for developments that human characters experienced without access to divine deliberation. The influence of the Epic of Gilgamesh upon subsequent literary traditions extended beyond the documented connections to biblical and Greek materials to encompass less traceable patterns of transmission through oral culture and popular narrative. The stories that circulated among the peoples of the ancient Near East carried themes and motifs that travelled along trade routes and migration paths, the epic's imagery and episodes potentially contributing to narrative traditions that left no written record of their indebtedness. The hero who undertakes a quest for immortality, the friend whose death initiates the protagonist's journey, the wise figure at the world's edge who provides guidance, the plant of life stolen by a serpent. These narrative elements appeared in various forms across cultures that may or may not have known the Mesopotamian originals. The possibility that the Epic of Gilgamesh participated in broader patterns of narrative diffusion suggested that its influence might be even more extensive than the demonstrable textual connections could establish. The story contributing to human storytelling traditions in ways that scholarly analysis could never fully recover. The walls of Uruk that the epic's conclusion celebrated as Gilgamesh's enduring achievement have themselves become archaeological sites where modern excavation has uncovered remains corresponding to the textual descriptions, the material evidence confirming the existence of substantial defensive construction during the early dynastic period when the historical Gilgamesh would have reigned. The fired brick that the epic praised as demonstrating the quality of the wall's construction appeared in the archaeological record. The material remains validating the text's claims regarding building techniques. The circuit of the walls that the epic invited readers to walk could be traced through the mounds that mark the ancient city's extent, the distance corresponding to figures that textual sources provided. The correspondence between literary description and archaeological reality demonstrated that the epic, despite its legendary and supernatural elements, preserved genuine memory of the urban achievement that defined Uruk during its period of greatest influence. The transformation of literary monument into archaeological site completed a circle of commemoration that connected ancient textual production to modern scholarly recovery, Gilgamesh's fame continuing to attract attention to the city whose walls he built. The legacy of the Epic of Gilgamesh within the history of human civilization encompassed its status as the first extended literary narrative, while simultaneously transcending that historical priority through the continuing relevance of its themes and the enduring power of its artistic achievement. The text that emerged from the reed styluses of Mesopotamian scribes more than 4,000 years ago continued to find readers who recognized in its ancient verses expressions of concerns that remained vital across the millennia of subsequent human experience. The questions that Gilgamesh asked about the meaning of mortal existence, the possibilities for continuing beyond death, the proper response to loss and limitation, these questions had not been answered by the intervening centuries of philosophical and religious reflection, and the epic's treatment of them retained its capacity to illuminate and console. The friendship between Gilgamesh and Enkidu, forged through conflict and deepened through shared adventure, provided a model of human connection that subsequent literary traditions would elaborate but never surpass in its essential depiction of how two souls might complete each other. The grief that followed Enkidu's death, the desperate quest that grief initiated, and the wisdom that ultimately emerged from the failure of that quest traced an emotional and spiritual journey that remained recognizable to anyone who had loved, lost, and learned. The story of Gilgamesh, inscribed upon tablets of clay that waited beneath Mesopotamian soil for millennia, before revealing themselves to modern understanding, had demonstrated that human achievement could indeed outlast the brief span of individual existence, the narrative itself constituting proof of the principle it advocated. the king who sought immortality among the gods found it instead among humanity. His name preserved not through magical intervention, but through the patient labour of scribes who recognised in his story something worthy of transmission across generations. The walls of Uruk had crumbled into mounds that only archaeological expertise could interpret, but the story of their builder endured in translations read by audiences whose languages had not existed when the epic was composed. The oldest written story in human history continued to speak across the ages, carrying wisdom that the accumulated centuries had not rendered obsolete, offering to all who encountered it the consolation that meaning could be found within the boundaries of mortal existence, and that the works of human hands and minds could achieve a permanence that individual lives could never possess. Gilgamesh the king, 2/3 divine and 1/3 human, had learned through suffering what the gods had always known, that mortality defined the human condition not as a curse to be escaped, but as the framework within which all human meaning must be sought, and that the proper response to this limitation lay not in desperate quests for personal transcendence, but in the creation of achievements that would endure, the building of walls that would protect, the inscription of stories that would preserve, and the cultivation of friendships that would illuminate the brief bright interval between birth and the darkness that awaited all who drew breath beneath the Mesopotamian sky.